The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Kirsten Hannum, Elizabeth Houghton, and Jesse McDonald. Jesse attended the University of British Columbia and received a BSc before completing his graduate degree at Simon Fraser University in a Master's of Pest Management. His career with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada began with 10 years as a field technician with the Pest Management Centre. In 2018, he began his role as biologist, knowledge and technology transfer in Summerland, which allows him to be a part of a wide array of research projects, including pest management, plant physiology, climate adaptation initiatives, and Indigenous collaborations, all of which he greatly enjoys. He has published a number of peer-reviewed virology, fungal phytopathology, and entomology scientific papers, as well as outreach and science communication materials. Jesse is active in various scientific associations, regional and local agriculture associations, and local community, including as a long-term member of Penticton and District Search and Rescue. Now let's get into the episode with Kirsten, Elizabeth, and Jesse.
Well, hello, John. How are you doing?
Hi, Dave. Here we go. No Lysandra to keep us in order.
Okay, so let's have some fun with this one so she can edit away. And so we're so fortunate to have guests with us today from BC, Kirsten Hammond and Jesse McDonald. And I'm going to ask if you could to introduce yourselves to our listeners so they understand your roles. Jesse, if I could, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. My name is Jesse McDonald. I'm a biologist for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Summerland Research and Development Centre in Summerland, British Columbia. My role currently is knowledge and technology transfer, so I'm meant to make our science accessible to the end user, which could be policymakers, academia, other regulatory bodies, the public, yourselves, anyone really. And the way that I approach that depends on the message that I'm spreading or the project that I'm associated with.
Excellent, thank you. And Kirsten, if you could.
Thanks, David. I'm really glad to be here as well. And like Jesse, I work for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Summerland Research and Development Centre. My position is called an agroecologist. I'm a research scientist who's essentially tasked with trying to understand how we can adapt to climate change, so how our agricultural producers can change what they grow or how they grow it to be able to continue to grow crops in this new climate that we're experiencing, and also how to use agriculture to mitigate climate change. So how can we manage our crops to pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by growing plants? And how can we alter our management practices so that we produce less greenhouse gases in the future?
Well, welcome to you both. And I know John and I have been looking forward to this. You know, we have had podcasts on the agriculture sector. We do stuff in the manufacturing sector, but I think many listeners aren't aware of how critical or essential the agriculture sector is and how important it is in so many areas besides feeding us. And so that's why it's quite timely that we have this discussion. So thank you for joining us. I'll turn this over to John to ask the first question.
Thanks, Dave. My first question is really about a definition. And it's interesting, you know, when things like climate change has happened, we've all had to learn new language. Was it global warming? Is it climate change? What's adaptation? What's mitigation? Etc., etc. And different people in different areas have slightly different interpretations. So with that as a backdrop, what is climate resiliency?
So climate resiliency, we often hear about climate mitigation, and that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, sequestering carbon, all that sort of stuff. And that's kind of what dominates the conversation. Climate resiliency in agriculture, in this case, is ensuring that our agricultural systems are able to weather the effects of climate change. So meaning climate extremes might come in, a heat dome as we had last spring, or the atmospheric river as we had last fall, and being able to bounce back from those and continue on after those extreme events are over and not be terminated or having to restart. So it's about our ability to just weather the changes that climate change is bringing upon us.
Well, that's good, because one of the things we try to do with our podcast is it's very easy to slip into language that we're all familiar with, and a listener's I haven't got a clue what they've said. So that gives us a great starting point for this podcast. Thanks, Jesse. Dave.
And certainly, as you mentioned, Jesse, BC has been hit a couple of times quite dramatically. So certainly, you firsthand experience in both these areas. It's going to be interesting to hear your point of views. My question is, what are your views as researchers on climate resiliency?
Let's see. Well, like Jesse said, we hear a lot in the media about climate mitigation and how to reduce our impacts on the climate by reducing the amount of greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere. But it is going to take us a long time to right this ship. And in the meantime, we have a growing population and everybody needs to eat. So, climate resiliency, or its cousin, adapting to climate change to ensure that we are resilient to climate change, is a really critical piece of work that we really need to do to make sure we're all fed. And that is going to take time because we're going to need to develop tools to improve our resiliency on many different scales. There are tools that we could identify and deploy now that can help us from year to year, but we also need to help ensure that our agricultural systems are resilient by looking to the future and imagining what agriculture is going to look in the future with people living in different places, different amounts of water available, appetites for different types of crops, and the needs that those crops have in order to be productive. So, this is not just a short term fix, it's really, really important. And we have to think on different scales.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Kirsten's saying. So, climate change is here. We're already seeing the effects of it. We do have to be resilient to it. We do have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We do have to sequester carbon, but it's here. The effects are here. We have to be resilient to it. For example, the heat dome last year, I believe it was 9 degrees over the average for that time of year. They attributed 6 degrees of that 9 degrees to climate change. So there's 3 degrees that, not totally sure, but at least 6 degrees of that was attributed to climate change. That would not have happened without it. So we have to be resilient to that, and our agricultural systems have to be resilient to that. This is not a future problem, it's a now problem.
Could you talk to us a bit about your current programs and initiatives that you're involved in support climate resiliency? It would be nice to have some examples of, what you're doing and how it's making a difference.
Yeah, Kirsten and I actually, over the last 2 years probably, we've been really excited to start developing what we've dubbed a climate toolbox for our growers, tree fruits, and vineyards. We're specifying on tree fruits mostly these days, but we're trying to develop tools that they can deploy for what's best for their sites and their orchards and for the specific events, weather events and climate events that are coming up. For example, we've been involved with a project on a phenomenon known as sudden apple decline, which we didn't know what was happening at the beginning of that project. After this 3-year project, it looks like it's climate related. It looks like the trees are collapsing due to tree water transportation bottlenecks. So not enough water is getting to the top of the tree and the trees are dying. So one example of this toolbox that we've started to develop is a calcium carbonate spray. It's basically a sunscreen that you go and spray in your orchards, and it coats the leaves with this clay layer and the fruit, and it reduces sunburn on the apples and evapotranspirative loss from the leaves. So that's just one example. Another example is we're working with a plant physiologist, Dr. Hao Zhu, who's also in Summerland here. And we're looking at using bigger rootstocks in apple trees. So the rootstock is the bottom part of the tree, that's the root system. And then you graft the scion, which is whatever cultivar you want, the Gala, the Macintosh, the Spartan, the Salish, onto that rootstock. It controls the vigor of the tree. So that's where you get the smaller high density orchards versus the old style large trees. So over the past 2 decades, growers have all moved to these high density orchards with these dwarfing rootstocks. So they're small rootstocks. We're talking about shifting to a little bit bigger rootstocks because it'll allow more water transport from the roots up into the scion. And maybe that will mitigate some of this water stress that we're seeing related to sudden apple decline.
Why tree fruit? Why is that focus on? Is it because the economics behind that for for BC, or is it just because it's your specialist area versus vineyards?
I think, Jesse, correct me if I'm wrong, but each of the research and development centers that Agricultural Canada has established across the country have different specialties based on the types of crops that are grown in that region. And as a result, here at Summerland, we focus on woody perennial fruit production because those are the dominant crops that are grown. Our colleagues at the Agassiz Research and Development Center down on the coast look at other crops. There are specialists in dairy production, vegetables, small fruit like blueberries and raspberries. So, for the most part, the research scientists located at each research center tend to focus on the crops that are predominantly grown in that region. There are exceptions, but that's usually the case.
Okay, thank you for that, Kirsten. And just another follow-up, because you had mentioned the difference in growing. Jesse, you talked about the dwarf apple trees versus the traditional large apple orchard. Is that a function of productivity improvements or lowering cost, or is that a function of climate change that's driving that, or is it a combination of all those things?
It's mostly a function of economics. So you actually get an increased yield per acre growing on those smaller trees. And there's also less labor. So those trees are 12 feet tall. It's easier to get up to the top of those trees than it is to get up to the top of a 25-foot large tree. The apple trees also typically are producing fruit on the outside of the tree. So the current year's fruit is on 1-year-old wood. So that means that's wood that started growing in the previous year. That means with these large trees, you're typically getting apples just on the outside, which means you have a bunch of unproductive space on the inside. And the apples on the inside, if there are any, also are not getting as much sunlight, so they're not coloring up as much, and you're not getting that grade A product. So then what the dwarfing rootstocks allow for in those high density orchards, decreased labor costs, increased production, and better fruit quality. And that's been 2 or 3, probably 3 decades for the predominant orchard system.
Do you get production from the trees sooner than the older, like I think I was quoting earlier podcast that I thought it was it took 3 or 4 years before you got production. With the dwarf trees, do you get production sooner with the dwarf trees, or it still takes the same amount of time?
I believe it's about the same amount of time because you're grafting the scion onto that rootstock. And so it's still about 4 years. If you were to grow an apple tree from seed, not only could you not control, or you wouldn't know what type of apple you're going to get, and you're likely to get a poorly tasting apple. Our breeding program here does about 30,000 crosses a year, and of those, one might go to market as a good tasting enough apple. It would take over 8 years to get apples on a tree that's grown from seed versus grafting onto a rootstock.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And thank you for bearing with me. It was kind of information that I wanted to learn. So next question for you folks is, what are some of the examples of farmers' resiliency?
Yeah, there are all kinds of really great examples. Jesse mentioned our climate resilience toolbox and some of the tools we're trying to fill that toolbox with. And maybe I'll add a couple examples that are more water related. Here in the Okanagan Valley, the climate is semi-arid. You can't grow commercial crops without irrigation water. And as a result, being able to reduce water consumption if necessary, for example, if there's emergency drought restrictions, is going to be really critical, or else to use your water more efficiently. So over the last couple decades, almost all tree fruit and wine grape producers have shifted from overhead sprinklers that use water quite inefficiently to under tree and under vine drippers and micro sprinklers, which apply the water much more efficiently. You lose a lot less water to evaporation. A lot more water makes it into the soil where it's available for the crops. But there's still more work that can be done. We've been looking at the use of organic amendments such as compost or mulches to improve the soil's ability to hold on to water. And we're looking at the use of irrigation scheduling so that you only apply as much water as the crop needs to keep growing. And then we're also looking at how we might strategically apply water through the growing season for different crops so that it's available for the crops that need it most when they need it most. So an example of this is some work that PhD student Elizabeth Houghton is doing, looking at the potential of post-harvest deficit irrigation in sweet cherry crops. So I thought Elizabeth might want to describe what that is and what she's found.
Great. Thanks, Kirsten. So just to reiterate, it's going to be very important that we use water efficiently moving forward, especially as climate change is predicting lower snowpacks, earlier spring runoff, and summer droughts and potential for more extreme weather. So what we've been looking at in sweet cherry is reducing irrigation in the late summers after the fruit have been picked. And we call this strategy post-harvest deficit irrigation. This is an important time to try and reduce water use, as usually it's a time in the season when water reservoirs are already quite low and there's a fairly high demand for water for irrigation. So to try and improve climate resiliency within sweet cherry crops, we've been looking at post-harvest deficit irrigation. So over the last 3 years, we ran an experiment where we reduced irrigation water in 5 different commercial cherry orchards located in the Okanagan Valley by up to 50%. And this could result in a significant water saving applied throughout the valley if these more sustainable irrigation management techniques are adopted at a larger scale. And what we found was that growers have a great opportunity to refine the irrigation that they apply. Because this reduction of 50% irrigation water in the late summers after the fruit had been picked, we found that it had no significant effect on important indicators of tree growth and fruit quality and yield that were important to growers.
Interesting.
I think this work is really exciting because it has implications for water availability in the whole region. If sweet cherry producers can reduce the amount of water that they use after their crops are harvested, that water, as Elizabeth was saying, is then available perhaps to be used by other crops that are harvested later in the season and still require water after sweet cherries are harvested. Or, as Elizabeth was also saying, water supplies are becoming increasingly erratic and unreliable, and we are also concerned about water being available for other uses. For example, we need to make sure that there's enough water in streams so that riparian habitats are sustained. Being able to strategically reduce water consumption in one crop earlier in the season might be useful in helping make sure that water is available for a whole host of other needs.
This has been a fascinating tour around resiliency, but unfortunately, we're coming towards the end of the podcast. And our standard way of finishing our podcasts is to ask you a simple question: what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners? So, if there's just one paragraph that they should remember from this whole podcast, what's it going to be?
I think the biggest takeaway from this, from my perspective, is that we definitely do need to take action to mitigate climate change or reduce climate change into the future. But that ship is going to take a long time to turn around. And in the meantime, we need to be able to grow food for our growing population in a way that still protects other values that we have, the environment, for example, human needs, and doing work that improves our resiliency to climate change is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we do have to be prepared for the effects of climate change now. So you will see the effects in the supermarket from our agricultural systems being exposed to these extremes. For example, apple prices this year in British Columbia, that was because of the heat dome last year, which affected the bud formation of the apples this year. So we are seeing the effects right now. There's not really a way around that currently, but what we can do is try and address the individual aspects of climate change that we're seeing. For example, preparing orchards for heat events and preparing growers for ways to react to that when they know that they're coming. Or same with cold events, frost fans, for example, giving them tools that allow them to react to these things in real time is the only way for these systems to remain and through this climate change period. However, there could be opportunity as the climate changes for new crops to come in. And so there is opportunity for us to expand our industry and change our industry. The industry has changed in the past, peaches to tree fruits, and now we're going through a transition into a lot of vineyards. And all of that has to do with climate. So we do have to prepare for it. We do have to try and mitigate climate change, but we also have to be prepared to pivot because of it.
Dave, what's your takeaway?
I think it's kind of a macro approach, and that is, John, we talked to so many different people in so many different industries, and everyone's getting hit. And the fact what Kirsten and Jesse and Elizabeth have talked about is in detail of how it's impacting tree fruit in BC. Everyone's being impacted. And I thought if there's anyone who will adopt, because I have full belief, is the agriculture community, because quite frankly, they've had to adopt in the past because of weather, but now even more so. And so I think our listeners will really appreciate all the things. There's a lot to agriculture. It's not just you put a tree in and you pick the crop. There's so much to it, and it's so dependent on knowledge and educated workforce. So I got a ton out of how much it's being impacted and all the things that, science is doing to help protect and to adopt. Even though I have sort of background in this and had exposure in the horticulture, I haven't been in it for a long time. It's really nice to hear all the things that are going on to adopt to it, because as Jesse, Kirsten, and Elizabeth said, it's inevitable, it's going to happen. So I was pleased to hear, that things are being done and that we as a society in every sector need to be focusing on this. No one's going to be untouched.
Yeah, I think what's come to me is I threw the words mitigation and adaptation at the beginning, and we had how resiliency is part of adaptation. And I feel the climate change community as a whole has tended to back off adaptation because they thought it might take the focus off mitigation. But we've got to do something about adaptation now. It's clear, we suggested 1.5 is that ship has sailed. We've got to do something about it now. And what's fascinating is almost, I don't want to decry what you're doing, but at a micro level in the global problem, you are doing something about that adaptation and about how we can continue to have apples and, more importantly, vines. It's been a pleasure having this podcast with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your interest.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us on here. It was great.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.